There is something I have carried for so long that I sometimes forget it has weight. You get used to a burden the way you get used to a bad knee or a draft that comes through the wall every winter. It becomes part of the furniture of your life, and you stop noticing it until someone else walks in and flinches. That flinch, I have seen it 10,000 times. And I'm going to tell you about the first time and all the times after, because I'm old enough now that the telling matters more than the protecting of anyone's comfort, including my own. My name is Eleanor Marsh. I was born in the spring of 1839 in a small town in western Pennsylvania called Harwick, which was not much more than a mill, a church, 2 dry goods stores, and the kind of stubbornness that passes for community when people have nowhere else to go. My father worked the mill. My mother kept the house and 4 children, of which I was the second. We were not poor in the way that means starving. We were poor in the way that means you know exactly how many candles are left, and you do not light one unless the work requires it. I want to tell you what I looked like before, not out of vanity. Lord knows vanity became a foreign country to me soon enough, but because it matters to the story. I had dark hair that my mother braided every morning before school. I had what people called a pleasant face, not remarkable, not the kind that stops a room, but the kind that belonged, that fit in, that made other people comfortable enough to smile back without thinking about it. I was 17 years old, and I fit into the world the way a hand fits into a glove made for it, perfectly, thoughtlessly, without gratitude. The summer of 1856 arrived the way summers do in Pennsylvania, slowly at first, then all at once, the heat pressing down on the valley like something with intention. I remember the smell of that summer, cut grass and mill dust in the river low enough that it gave off a thick mineral odor by midday. I remember sitting on the porch the evening before everything changed, watching the fireflies come up from the meadow. My younger sister Ruth was beside me, and we were talking about nothing, the way young women talk when life has not yet asked anything serious of them. 3 days later, I was in bed with a fever. I will not dwell on the sickness itself, because the sickness is not the story. What the sickness left behind, that is the story. It came fast and it burned high, and it lasted the better part of 6 weeks, and the doctor who rode out from the next town did what doctors did then, which was not much more than watch and wait and tell my mother to keep me cool and pray. I drifted in and out of something that was not quite sleep. I remember voices, but not words. I remember the weight of wet cloth on my forehead. I remember my mother's hands, which were rough from years of washing and wringing, and how strange it was that even in that fever, those hands felt like the safest thing in the world. The illness had a name, though I didn't learn it clearly until much later. It was a form of infection, something that had settled into the tissues of my face with a particular cruelty that no one in Harwick had seen before, and that the doctor struggled to explain in terms that made sense to a family like ours. He used words I did not know. My father nodded as though he understood them. My mother asked only one question: "Will she live?" And the doctor said he believed so, yes. He believed she would live. He was right. I lived. What he did not say, what perhaps he could not bring himself to say to a mother standing in a dim hallway with her hands clasped, was what living would look like. I did not know yet. For those weeks of fever, I was not thinking about my face. I was thinking about water, about coolness, about the strange dreams that kept pulling me under into places that had no names. When the fever finally broke, I remember the particular quality of the light that came through the window, pale and clean and very still, and thinking, I am still here. Just that. The uncomplicated animal relief of still being present in the world. It was my sister Ruth who brought me broth, and I remember watching her face as she came through the door, the bowl careful in both hands, her eyes fixed on it so she would not spill. And then she looked up at me, and she stopped. Not dramatically, not with a gasp or a cry. She simply stopped, in the middle of a step, and her expression did something I had no name for then, though I have spent decades since finding words for it. It was not horror exactly. It was the face of someone who has just understood something they cannot undo. She came forward. She set the broth down. She said, in a voice held very carefully level, "You must be so hungry." She did not look directly at me again for the rest of the visit. I did not understand why. Not yet. I was weak and the broth was warm and I was grateful for it, and I fell asleep again before I could hold any thought long enough to worry it into meaning. But something had registered. The way she stopped. The way her eyes did not come back to mine. The way the room felt suddenly different. Not in any way I could name, only in the way that a familiar place feels when you return to it after a long absence and realize that time moved there too, without you. I did not know yet what I had lost. I only knew, in the vague and wordless way the body sometimes knows things before the mind does, that something in the arrangement of my life had shifted, quietly, permanently, while I was somewhere else. The mirror was a small one, tin-backed, that hung on the wall beside the washstand in the room my sister and I shared. I had looked into it every morning of my life without thinking about it. The same way you breathe, the same way your feet find the floor in the dark. It was simply part of the ritual of waking. Splash water, look up, tuck the loose strands back, go downstairs. I had never once stood in front of that mirror and felt anything at all. It was a neutral thing, a practical thing, no more charged with meaning than the wash basin itself. The morning I finally stood before it again, I was alone. Ruth had gone down to help with breakfast. I could hear the sound of the house moving below me, the scrape of the iron pan, my mother's voice giving some instruction, the low rumble of my father's reply. Ordinary sounds, the sounds of a world that had continued on its axis without interruption while I had been burning somewhere outside of time. I remember my hand on the edge of the washstand. I remember the cold of the ceramic basin. I remember that I was not frightened. Not exactly. I was cautious in the way you're cautious approaching something you cannot yet identify. My legs were still weak. My nightgown was loose at the shoulders. I leaned forward slowly, the way you might lean over the edge of a well to see how deep it goes. And I saw. I will not catalog what the illness had done, because the catalog is not what stayed with me. What stayed with me was the silence inside me when I looked. I had expected, I think, to feel something enormous, grief or rage or the kind of despair that collapses a person on the spot. What I felt instead was something quieter and in some ways worse. I felt a profound unfamiliarity. The face in that mirror was not a destroyed version of the face I knew. It was simply a different face. A stranger's face, arranged around the same eyes, looking back at me with an expression I could not read because I did not yet know how that face moved. I stood there for a long time. The sounds from downstairs continued. The pan scraped. My mother's voice rose and fell. I touched my cheek with 2 fingers. The reflection did the same. That small confirmation, yes, this is still you, this is still your hand, still your motion, was the strangest comfort I have ever felt. It was not relief. It was not acceptance. It was simply the beginning of the long work of understanding that the person in the mirror and I were going to have to find a way to live together. I pulled my hand back. I straightened. I went downstairs. No one at the breakfast table said anything about my face. My father looked at his plate. My mother served the porridge and asked whether I felt strong enough to sit up for the whole meal. Ruth talked about something she had seen through the window, a cart that had lost a wheel on the main road, the horse standing very patiently while the driver cursed. She told it carefully, with small details, as if she were filling the air on purpose, building a structure of ordinary words to keep the room from collapsing into what none of us were saying. I ate the porridge. It was salted the way I liked it. That detail struck me with sudden force. My mother had salted it the way I liked it, without asking, out of habit, out of the long accumulated knowledge of living with someone. And that small thing, that pinch of salt, undid me more than the mirror had. I kept my face down and I did not cry, because I understood instinctively that crying would crack something open that the rest of them were working very hard to keep sealed. So I swallowed it, the feeling and the porridge both, and I said the food was good, and I meant it. That was the first lesson the illness taught me, though I did not recognize it as a lesson then. The world would offer me its ordinary kindnesses, salted porridge, a blanket, a cup of something warm, and those kindnesses would continue to mean something, would continue to matter, even when everything else about how the world saw me had changed. The small acts of care from the people who loved me would not disappear. What would disappear was everything outside that circle. I spent 3 more days resting before I was strong enough to go outside. My mother suggested I wear a bonnet pulled low, and I understood without further discussion that she was not suggesting this for the weather. I wore it. I walked with her to the dry goods store on the main street, moving slowly, still regaining my legs, and I felt the late summer air on my skin, what skin remained as it had been, and it seemed to me extraordinary that the air felt exactly the same. The temperature, the slight dampness off the river, the smell of dust from the road, all of it unchanged, as if the world had registered nothing. Mrs. Calloway was behind the counter. She had known my mother for 20 years. She had given me peppermints as a child. She looked up when we came in, began the automatic smile of recognition, and then her face did the thing I had already seen Ruth's face do, that small arrested pause, that fraction of a second where the expression she had prepared became suddenly unusable and she had to reach for something else. She reached for excessive warmth. She said, "Eleanor, we are so glad you're recovered." She said it to a point just above my left shoulder. I said, "Thank you." I looked at the bolts of cloth on the shelf behind her. We bought what we needed, and we left. Walking home, my mother took my arm. She did not say anything, but she held on tighter than the walking required, and that tightness said everything she could not bring herself to put into words, that she had seen it too, what Mrs. Calloway had done, and that she was sorry, and that she did not know how to fix it, and that she was going to hold my arm anyway, tightly, for as long as I would let her. Harwick was not a cruel town. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy, and in some ways simpler, to say that the people there were hard-hearted, that they chose unkindness, that what happened after my illness was the result of some collective meanness that I could point to and name. It was not that. Cruelty with intention is almost easier to bear than what I actually encountered, because cruelty you can resist. You can harden yourself against it. You can build a wall and stand behind it. What Harwick gave me was something more difficult. It gave me discomfort, and discomfort, I learned, is far more corrosive than hatred, because it has no edges. You cannot argue with discomfort. You cannot appeal to it. It simply radiates outward from people like heat from a stone, and it reorganizes every room you walk into, every conversation you approach, before you have said a single word. The reorganization happened gradually, and then all at once, the way most permanent things do. In the first weeks after I was well enough to move through town, people were careful. That is the word I keep returning to, careful. They were careful with me the way you're careful around something that might break, or something that might, by its breaking, upset you. Conversations were shorter than they had been, invitations that had come easily before, to sit with the women after Sunday service, to join the younger girls for the quilting circle that met at the Hendersons' house every second Thursday, stopped arriving with the same naturalness. They did not stop entirely at first, but there was a new quality to them, a slight formality, a hesitation at the door of each interaction that had never been there before. I noticed it the way you notice a change in a familiar road, not because anything large has moved, but because your feet, which know the way by memory, keep finding the ground in a slightly different place. The quilting circle was where I felt it most clearly. I had been part of it since I was 14, learning first and then contributing, and I had loved those Thursday evenings. The smell of the Henderson parlor, which always had dried lavender somewhere, the particular sound of women talking freely when there were no men in the room, the way the conversation had moved from the practical to the personal and back again with a fluency that felt like its own kind of art. I went back 6 weeks after my recovery. I sat in my usual chair. I threaded my needle. The conversation continued around me the way a stream continues around a stone, touching me on both sides without quite including me, finding its way past rather than through. It was not that no one spoke to me. Margaret Howell asked about my health. Dorothea Price complimented the stitch I was using. But the difference between being spoken to and being part of a conversation is a difference I had never had to think about before. And now I thought about nothing else. I sat in that parlor for 2 hours, and I was as alone as I had ever been in my life, surrounded by women who had known me since childhood, who bore me no ill will, and who could not quite bring themselves to look at me directly for longer than the time it took to say something polite. I went home and I sat with it. I did not go back to the quilting circle after that. Not because I was told not to. I was not told anything so plain as that. I simply understood that my presence made the room harder for everyone in it, and I was not yet strong enough, not yet armored enough, to sit inside that difficulty week after week and call it company. The church was different in a way that was both better and worse. Better because the service itself required nothing of me. I could sit and listen and be left alone with God and the words, which asked nothing about my face. Worse because the after-service gathering on the steps, which had been one of my genuine pleasures, became a small ordeal I learned to move through quickly. People found reasons to turn away just as I approached. Children were the most honest. They stared without apology, the way children stare at anything they do not understand, and their mothers would pull them close with a hushed correction that I could not hear but did not need to. My father noticed. He was not a man who spoke easily about interior things, but one evening he sat down across from me at the kitchen table after supper when my mother and Ruth had gone upstairs, and he said, "You know that none of this is a reflection of your worth." He said it stiffly, reading it almost, as if he had practiced it and was relieved to get through it. And I loved him for the effort, and I told him so, and I meant it. But I also understood something he did not, that worth and belonging are not the same thing. A person can be entirely worthy and still find every door in a town slightly harder to open than it was the day before. Worth does not make you visible. Worth does not make the conversation open to include you. Worth is something you carry inside, and it is genuinely important, and it will get you through the long nights. But it will not put you back in that quilting circle chair. Not really. Not the same way you were before. There was one person who did not change, and that was my friend Clara Dean, who had been my closest companion since we were girls of 9 years old sharing a school bench. Clara was not without her own discomforts. I could see them sometimes, the brief effort it cost her to hold her expression neutral, but she made that effort reliably every time, and she came to see me twice a week and talked to me as if nothing between us had shifted, which was the most radical act of loyalty I have ever witnessed. She asked my opinion on things. She reported on gossip and waited for my reaction. She laughed at my observations and offered her own. She sat beside me and faced the same direction, and that simple physical fact, the two of us looking outward together rather than her looking at me as a problem to be managed, was worth more to me than I knew how to say then. I know how to say it now. It was everything. His name was Thomas Aldridge, and I had known him since we were both young enough that knowing someone meant simply living in the same small radius of roads and fields and sharing the same Sunday church and the same muddy spring and the same particular quality of boredom that belongs only to small towns on long winter afternoons. He was the son of the man who kept the second dry goods store, the quieter one at the end of the main street, and he had a way of listening that was rare in a young man, genuinely rare. I mean, not the performed patience that some men mistake for attentiveness. He listened as if what you were saying might actually change something in how he understood the world. We had begun, in the spring before my illness, something that had no formal name, but that everyone in Horrock understood to have a direction. He walked with me after church. He found reasons to stop by when he knew my father would be at the mill. He brought me a book once, a novel I had mentioned wanting to read, wrapped in brown paper as if it were a practical thing, a tool, and not what it clearly was, which was a declaration made in the only language he felt comfortable using. I received it in the spirit it was intended. I read it in 3 days and returned it with a note tucked inside that said I had enjoyed it very much and would welcome another recommendation if he happened to have one. He had one. He always had one. By May of 1856, before the fever arrived and altered everything, I believed, with the quiet certainty of a person who has not yet learned how quickly certainty can be revised, that Thomas Aldrich and I were moving toward something permanent. I did not say this out loud, not even to Clara, but I knew it the way you know the shape of a room you have spent years inside. I knew it in the particular attention he paid to what I said, in the way his face opened slightly when I came into a room, in the warmth of the silences between us that required no filling. After the illness, he came to see me once. It was early September, about a month after I had begun moving through town again. He came in the afternoon, hat in his hands, and my mother showed him to the front room where I was sitting with some mending. He sat across from me. He asked how I was feeling. I said I was stronger, thank you. He said he was glad to hear it. He looked at the floor between us with the concentration of a man studying scripture. We talked for perhaps 20 minutes. The conversation had the quality of something being carefully carried down a steep staircase, each sentence placed with deliberate slowness, each pause managed, nothing dropped, nothing broken, and yet the whole effort was so consuming that there was no room in it for anything real to pass between us. I watched him, and I thought, he is a good man. I thought it without bitterness, which surprises me still, even now. He was a good man doing something that was not good, and the distance between those two things was where all my grief lived. He did not come back after that visit. He did not send a note. He did not send another book. The thing between us, which had no formal name and therefore required no formal ending, simply stopped, the way a stream stops in a drought, not with any dramatic event, just a gradual withdrawal, until one day you notice the bed is dry and has been dry for some time. Clara told me the following spring that Thomas Aldrich had begun walking with a girl named Susan Pratt, who had come from a family in the next county. She told me carefully, watching my face, ready to absorb whatever I needed to release. I told her that I hoped he was happy. She searched my expression for evidence that I meant something else, and I let her search. And then I said it again. I genuinely hope he is happy, Clara. And the strange truth of it was that I did. Not because I was noble or beyond ordinary feeling. I was not. And the nights between his last visit and that conversation with Clara had not been peaceful ones, but because I had already understood, in the way that loss teaches you when you sit with it long enough, that what Thomas had withdrawn from was not me, not Eleanor Marsh, not the girl he had walked with after church, not the person who had read his books and written him careful notes. He had withdrawn from something he could not name and could not face, and that nameless thing had very little to do in the end with who I actually was. That understanding did not make it hurt less. I want to be honest about that. Understanding something and feeling it are two rooms in the same house, and you can stand in one and still hear everything happening in the other. I understood perfectly, and I ached completely, and both of those things were true at the same time for a very long while. What it did do, that understanding, was prevent me from building the wrong story around his absence. I did not decide that I was unworthy of being loved. I did not decide that what had existed between us had been an illusion. I decided instead that he was a man of his time, which means he was a man of his limitations, and that the life we might have built together would have required him to be larger than he knew how to be. That is not a condemnation. It is simply the truth, weighed honestly without the pleasure of anger to make it feel cleaner. I kept the book he had brought me. It was a good book. That seemed reason enough. There comes a point, after enough time has passed, when you stop waiting for things to return to what they were and begin instead the quieter, harder work of building what they might become. I cannot tell you exactly when that point arrived for me. It was not a single morning, not a decision made at a specific hour with the light coming through a specific window. It was more like the way a field recovers after a hard season, not all at once, not with any visible drama, but gradually in small patches, until one day you look out and realize that green has returned to places that were bare, and you cannot say precisely when it happened, only that it did. By the time I was 19, I had stopped measuring my days against what they had been before the summer of 1856. That measuring had been a particular kind of torture, holding each day up beside its predecessor and finding it diminished. I put that habit down the way you put down a tool that is doing more damage than work, deliberately and with some effort. And I did not always succeed, but I tried. What I built instead was a life that fit the actual dimensions of my world, rather than the imagined dimensions of a world that no longer existed. This sounds perhaps like resignation, and I understand why it might. But there is a difference, and it took me years to feel it clearly, between resignation and recalibration. Resignation is what happens when you stop believing anything is worth the effort. Recalibration is what happens when you redirect the effort toward what is actually possible. What was possible, I discovered, was more than Harwick had led me to believe. My mother had a practical streak that I inherited without knowing it, and it was she who first suggested that I might take in sewing work from the households in town. Not as charity. She was precise about that distinction, and I was grateful for her precision, but as a service, for fair payment, because I had always been capable with a needle, and because several of the women in town had more mending and alterations than their own time allowed. The transaction would be clean. Work offered, work accepted, payment made. No social performance required on either side. I would not need to sit in anyone's parlor and manage their discomfort. I would receive the garments, do the work at home, return them finished. It was, I realized, a form of freedom disguised as limitation. Within the walls of our house, with the cloth in my hands and the needle moving through it, and the particular silence of deep concentration around me, I was entirely myself. There was no audience. There was no room to read or manage. There was only the work, which asked nothing of my face and everything of my hands and my patience and my eye for what a seam needed. I was good at it. I became better. By the time I was 21, I had a steadier income from that work than I had ever imagined possible for a woman in my position, and the women of Herrick, whatever they felt in my presence, valued competence enough to keep sending their cloth. I want to be honest, though, and say that the walls of a house, however necessary, are still walls. There were days when the silence was not peaceful, but suffocating, when the needle felt like the only thing connecting me to a world that had otherwise closed its doors and latched them. There were afternoons in winter when the light died early and the town outside the window went about its business with a completeness that excluded me as thoroughly as if I had been on the other side of a sheet of glass, watching movement I could not enter. On those days I read. My father, who was not a demonstrative man in most respects, had built me a small shelf and filled it with what books he could find or afford, and added to it over the years with a quiet consistency that I chose to understand as his version of the apology he did not know how to speak. I read everything on that shelf multiple times, history and scripture and the occasional novel, and one volume on natural philosophy that I found so absorbing I nearly wore the binding through. Reading, I discovered, was the one form of company that required nothing of my appearance. An author dead 50 years did not flinch when I turned the page. The ideas inside a book did not reorganize themselves around my presence. They were simply there, consistent, offering the same thing each time. And there is a profound comfort in that consistency when the living world has become unpredictable. Clara continued to come twice a week. She had married a man named Henry Bower by the time I was 22, a decent man who worked the land his father had left him 3 miles outside town, and her life had filled up with the particular fullness of early marriage. And then, within the year, with the arrival of a daughter she named Agnes. She brought Agnes to see me when the child was 2 months old, bundled in white cloth, and placed her in my arms without hesitation or preamble. And Agnes looked up at my face with the wide, unfocused gaze of the very young and registered nothing unusual at all. I held that child for a long time. Clara watched us and said nothing. The silence between us in that moment was the most companionable silence I have ever sat inside. I worked. I read. Clara came. The seasons moved through Harwick in their usual order, indifferent as seasons always are to what is happening beneath them. And somewhere in the accumulation of those ordinary days, I found that I had built something that, if it was not the life I had once imagined, was nonetheless a life, real and mine, and held together by my own hands. That was not nothing. Some days it felt like everything. He came to Harwick in the autumn of 1863, which was a difficult year for everyone in Pennsylvania, the war having settled into the country's bones by then, like a cold that would not break. He was a traveling bookbinder named Samuel Cook, passing through on his way between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, stopping in small towns to collect damaged volumes and return them repaired, a trade that required patience and precision and a tolerance for solitude that I recognized immediately as a quality belonging to a particular kind of person. He was perhaps 50 years old, slight in the way that men who spend their lives bent over fine work sometimes are, with spectacles that he pushed up his nose habitually, as if they were always threatening to escape. He came to our door because my father had a damaged Bible, the spine cracked, several pages loose, and someone at the mill had mentioned there was a bookbinder in town for 2 days. My father was at work when Samuel Cook knocked, and my mother was at the neighbor's, and so it was I who answered the door alone. with no time to arrange myself or prepare for the encounter in the way I had learned to prepare for all encounters with strangers. I opened the door. He looked at me directly, not the glancing, redirected look I had grown so accustomed to reading in people's faces, but directly, with the simple attentiveness of a man assessing a situation before deciding how to proceed. He did not look away. He did not look above me, or to the side of me, or at some neutral point beyond my shoulder. He looked at my face the way a person looks at a face, as the natural starting point for a conversation between two human beings. He said, "Good afternoon. I understand there may be a volume in need of repair at this address." I said, "Yes, come in, please." And that was all. He came in. I showed him the Bible. He examined it with the careful attention of someone who takes damaged things seriously, turning the pages slowly, pressing gently along the spine, making small sounds of assessment that were professional and entirely unsentimental. He said he could have it repaired by the following afternoon. He named a price. I said that seemed fair. He wrote it in a small notebook he kept in his coat pocket. The whole exchange took perhaps 10 minutes and was entirely ordinary, except that it was not ordinary at all. It was the least ordinary thing that had happened to me in 7 years. When he came back the following afternoon with the Bible repaired, the spine firm, the pages resecured, the whole thing smelling faintly of the adhesive he used, which had a warm, slightly sweet quality. He handed it to me, and I examined it and said the work was very good. He thanked me with a small nod, the nod of a craftsman receiving an honest assessment from someone who had looked carefully. And then, instead of turning to leave, he paused. He said, "You have books, I see." He was looking past me into the front room at the shelf my father had built. I said, "I do. Quite a few, considering." He said, "Considering what?" And I found to my own surprise that I did not have a ready answer for that. Considering my circumstances, I might have said, considering that I am a woman who does not go out much, who has limited income, who lives in a small town in western Pennsylvania. But all of those answers felt suddenly insufficient, or perhaps beside the point, and so I said simply, considering that books are not cheap and space is limited. He accepted that answer without pressing further. But then he said something that I have turned over in my mind so many times, since that the words have worn smooth from the handling, like a stone kept in a pocket. He said, "A person with a shelf like that has been keeping themselves company for a long time. That is not a small thing." I did not respond immediately. I looked at him, and he was looking at the shelf, and his expression was not pitying and not curious and not careful in the managed way that people in Harwick were careful. It was simply observant. He had noticed something true and named it without ceremony, the way a craftsman notes a quality in a piece of work, not to be kind, not to perform empathy, but because it was there and it seemed worth acknowledging. I said, "Yes, it has been a long time." He looked back at me then, and he said, "You read natural philosophy, I see, the volume on the end." I said I did. He said he had repaired a copy of that same volume the previous year for a professor in Pittsburgh who had read it so thoroughly the binding had given up entirely. I laughed at that, a genuine laugh, which startled me with its own sound, the way a familiar voice startles you when you have not heard it in longer than you realized. We talked for perhaps half an hour, standing in the doorway with the afternoon light coming in at a low angle the way it does in October in Pennsylvania, orange and very clean, lying flat across the floorboards. We talked about books and about the particular loneliness of long winters and about what it meant to spend a life repairing things that other people had used until they broke. He said there was a philosophy in that work, if you wanted to find one. I said I thought there probably was. When he left, he shook my hand, not with the reluctant brevity of someone discharging an obligation, but firmly, the way you shake the hand of a person you have genuinely enjoyed speaking with and expect to remember. He walked down the road and did not look back, and I stood in the doorway for a moment after he had gone, holding the repaired Bible and feeling something I had nearly forgotten the texture of, the feeling of having been seen, plainly, without effort, without anyone having to overcome anything to manage it, just seen. The years after Samuel Cook passed through Harwick did not transform themselves into something easier simply because I had been reminded that ease was possible. That is not how life works, and I knew it even then, standing in the doorway with the October light fading and the sound of his footsteps gone from the road. One afternoon of genuine conversation does not undo 7 years of careful invisibility, but it does something more durable than undoing. It leaves a mark of proof, evidence held quietly inside you, that the thing you feared might be permanently lost is in fact still intact, still accessible, still real. I carried that proof through the long middle years the way you carry a compass through unfamiliar country, not looking at it constantly, but knowing it is there, knowing that if you become sufficiently disoriented, you can reach for it, and it will tell you which direction is true. The long middle years. I've been turning that phrase in my mind for some time now, trying to find a more precise description, and I keep returning to it because it is accurate in a way that more dramatic language is not. They were not years of great suffering. They were not years of great joy. They were years of sustained, ordinary living, conducted at the particular pitch that becomes possible when you have made your peace, or something close enough to peace that the difference becomes academic with the actual shape of your existence. My mother passed in the winter of 1871. She had been ill for several months with something that settled in her chest and would not leave, and I nursed her through it with the same hands that had learned, by then, to do most of the practical work of our household. My father was not a capable man in illness, not cruel, simply helpless in the way that some people are helpless when the ordinary structures of a day dissolve. And so the nursing fell to me, and I was glad to do it. Glad is perhaps too simple a word. I was grateful for the purpose, and I was grateful for the hours beside her bed, which gave me something I had not always had in those years, the clear and uncomplicated sense of being necessary. She died in February on a morning when the snow outside was very still, and the light had that particular white quality that winter mornings have in Pennsylvania, flat and even, making everything look temporary. I held her hand at the end. She did not say anything remarkable. Remarkable last words belong mostly to books, I have found. What she said, near the end, was that she was tired and that the room was cold, and could I bring another blanket? I brought it. She was gone within the hour. Those were the last words she spoke to me, and I have never found them inadequate. My father followed her 3 years later, and then it was just the house and me and the shelf of books and the sewing work, which had by that time expanded considerably, several of the wealthier households in the surrounding area having heard through some chain of recommendation that I did fine work and was reliable and required nothing socially from the transaction. Ruth had married young and moved to Ohio with her husband, a man who worked the railroads, and she wrote letters with a regularity that diminished, as letters between sisters will, as her own life filled up with children and distance and the thousand specific demands of a different existence in a different place. I wrote back faithfully. There were long gaps on both sides, and neither of us mentioned them. The letters, when they came, were warm and newsy and carefully avoided, by unspoken mutual agreement, any direct acknowledgement of the life I was living alone in the house on the edge of Harwick. Clara remained. Clara always remained. Her daughter Agnes grew into a girl of 10, then 15, then a young woman who came with her mother on visits and who had, from her earliest age, treated me with a matter-of-factness that I found more restorative than any amount of deliberate kindness. Agnes did not perform comfort in my presence. She simply inhabited it. She argued with me about the books I recommended. She told me at length about the things that interested her, the natural world especially, birds in particular, which she catalogued with a seriousness that reminded me of the natural philosophy volume on my shelf, and which I encouraged with genuine enthusiasm, because watching a young person pursue something with that quality of focused attention is one of the more quietly joyful things available to a person in this life. Through Agnes, I understood something about visibility that I had not grasped before. I had thought of visibility as a single thing. You are seen or you are not. But Agnes showed me it was more various than that. She saw me as a person who knew things, as someone whose opinion on books and ideas and the behavior of people was worth soliciting and arguing with. That was a particular kind of visibility, narrow in some ways and complete in others, and it mattered to me more as the years passed than I would have predicted when I was 17, and believed that being seen meant being seen by everyone, in every room, all at once. The town of Harwick changed around me, as towns do. Families came and went, children I'd watched grow up from behind our front window, moved away to cities or married into neighboring counties, and were replaced by new children I did not know. The mill where my father had worked changed hands twice and was eventually expanded. A second church was built. The roads were improved. The world was moving in the direction it always moves, which is forward, with or without your participation, indifferent to whether you're keeping up. I watched it from inside my life, from behind my shelf of books and my needlework and my twice-weekly visits from Clara. And I felt about it the way you feel about weather moving across a valley, interested, sometimes stirred, occasionally moved, but no longer injured by the distance between myself and its center. Distance, I had learned, is not always exile. Sometimes it is simply where you end up standing, and the view from there has its own particular clarity. I am 81 years old as I tell you this. My hands still work, which I consider the primary evidence that life has been, on balance, fair to me in the ways that matter most. The shelf my father built is still on the wall, though I've long since filled it twice over and begun stacking volumes horizontally across the tops of the upright ones, which a librarian would find offensive, but which pleases me in the way that a full pantry pleases a person who has known lean seasons. Clara passed 6 years ago quietly in her sleep, the way people who have lived honestly tend to go, without drama, without unfinished business, with their hands folded and their affairs in order. Agnes comes now in her mother's place, every week without fail, a woman of middle age herself, with gray beginning at her temples and the same quality of direct attention her mother had. And I find that continuity more comforting than I can easily say. I have had a long time to think about what happened to me in the summer of 1856 and what it made of the life that followed. And I want to tell you what I have concluded, not because my conclusions are the only valid ones, but because I am the only person left who was present for all of it, and that carries a kind of obligation. You do not get to be the last witness and stay silent. At least I do not. Here's the first thing I have concluded. The illness did not ruin my life. I want to say that plainly because it is the thing people most expect me to say the opposite of, and because the expectation itself is worth examining. People hear a story like mine and they construct a particular shape around it. Tragedy, loss, a life diminished. And they wait for the narrator to confirm that shape. I am not going to confirm it. Not because my life was without difficulty or grief or the particular ache of watching the world arrange itself around your absence without seeming to notice. It was full of all of those things. But difficulty is not ruin. Grief is not ruin. An ache that lasts decades is not ruin. A life can contain all of those things and still be, in its final accounting, genuinely worth having lived. The second thing I have concluded is harder to say and more important. The people of Harwick, the ones who looked away, who redirected their conversations, who found it easier to manage their discomfort than to sit inside it long enough to see past it. Those people were not monsters. I spent a number of years, in my 20s especially, turning them over in my mind with something that was close to contempt, searching for a moral verdict that would make their behavior fully explicable and therefore fully separate from anything I might ever do myself. I did not find that verdict because it does not exist. They were ordinary people responding to something their ordinary lives had not prepared them to encounter. That's a human failure, and is very widespread, and it caused me real and lasting harm, and is also not the whole of any of them. Thomas Aldrich, who withdrew so completely, worked his farm for 50 years, raised children who were by all accounts decent people, and died, I was told, helping a neighbor shore up a collapsed barn wall in a rainstorm. A man is not only the worst thing he has done. I had to learn that lesson at considerable personal expense, and I pass it along to you freely. The third thing, and this is the one I find myself returning to most often in these late years, when the house is quiet and the shelf is full and Agnes has gone home, is about Samuel Cook, the bookbinder who came to our door in October of 1863 and looked at my face the way a person looks at a face. I never saw him again. He passed through Harwick once and kept moving, as traveling men do, and whatever life he went on to live, I have no knowledge of and no way of finding. But what he did in that half hour, That simple, unremarkable, utterly ordinary act of looking directly at another human being and speaking to them as though their presence required no special management changed something in me that had been in the process of calcifying. He did not do it out of heroism. He was not making a statement or performing virtue. He simply had, for whatever reason of character or circumstance, or the particular education that comes from spending a life traveling between towns and meeting all manner of people on doorsteps, the capacity to see a person before he saw anything else about him. That capacity is not rare because it is difficult. It is rare because it requires, for a single sustained moment, the willingness to let your own discomfort be less important than someone else's humanity. That's a small ask. It is astonishing how seldom it is answered. I'm telling you this now because you're alive in a world that still contains people who are looked past, looked around, looked through. The reasons change, the century changes, the specific fear or strangeness changes, but the mechanism is the same. A person stands in a room and the room reorganizes itself to exclude them, not with malice, but with the accumulated thoughtlessness of people who have never had to think about it. You may be one of those people. I'm not saying that to wound you. I'm saying it because I was, once, before the summer of 1856, and I had no idea. You never do, until suddenly the room is reorganizing itself around you. Look at people directly. Speak to them as if their answer might matter. Hold the space open a moment longer than your comfort recommends. It costs almost nothing, and it is worth, to the person receiving it, more than you will ever be told. I lived 81 years in this world, most of them as someone the world found easier to overlook than to see. And I am here telling you this because someone should. Because the telling is what remains when everything else has run its course. Take it with you. Let it ask something of you. That is all I have. That is enough.